Hello and welcome to R Squared Racing. We are using data-driven approach to look into Formula One predictions using AI as our sidekick to help justify our choices for a fantasy Formula One team. Now, before we begin, I want to kick it off with a couple of news. So if you haven't looked at it already, you may be already aware Gasly is staying in AlphaTauri, and that is fantastic news. Not for Gasly, but for the news that is about to follow, which is what's going to happen at Red Bull, because Albon is simply not delivering, and I truly believe that now it's going to become a question of Hülkenberg versus Perez. Left Christian Horner a couple of voicemails. Christian, if you're watching this, then give me a ring back. I'm interested in hearing what your feedback is. But until that day happens, which I don't think it will, we're probably looking at a choice of Hülkenberg versus Perez, and someone made the argument that I think is a very valid argument that Perez might be the one to be selected. And I thought it was Hülkenberg at first, but I lean towards Perez now simply because of the argument that Red Bull is about to lose their Aston Martin title sponsorship, and with no announcement in sight for someone who would jump in as that title sponsor, Red Bull could potentially be looking for cash, especially because of the whole Honda exit debacle, which means that they are trying to take over the engine program. More money is going to have to be spent on it, and Perez's backing with money certainly helps make the case of why he would be a better candidate to be alongside Verstappen for next year. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comment below, but I genuinely think that Perez here is going to be the one that makes the jump if Albon fails to deliver a fourth place result at the very least at Imola this weekend. So an important note while we're talking about Red Bull and AlphaTauri actually, simply because AlphaTauri is actually the only team that has has tested at Imola this year, which means that while everyone has been outside of Imola since 2006, nobody's driven their post-hybrid era cars at Imola yet, but AlphaTauri has, and I believe that might be an advantage for this weekend, and we're going to talk about that when it comes time for predictions. But the final piece of news, at the time that I'm recording this, I just found out that Alfa Romeo just announced that Kimi and Giovinazzi are staying, which is fantastic news for Kimi. I am a little surprised on the Giovinazzi side, I'll be quite honest, but I am happy he gets a chance. Caro, se stai guardando, in bocca al lupo quest'anno e l'anno prossimo. And kind of moving on then, let's get started with our track analysis here. So if we move into our track analysis, we're starting to get into the nitty-gritty of what these predictions are all about. So here's what we have. Currently, I'm looking at the average total points that a constructor can score in a race. This is by half because it's by individual driver, so it'd be ×2, but I will get that cleaned up. This is the average points that Lewis or the individual drivers will score, as you can see by Lewis in lead here. And then we can see some other items. Now, I am using the Pirelli preview simply because we don't have any information in Imola, and as we use artificial intelligence and machine learning depends on having a good history of events to make their predictions, we're going to try to use Pirelli's circuit information to get an idea. And if I start filtering out, and I'm going to add in the 2019 season as well, but if I start filtering out the levels here, so we pick the downforce levels, and we do not have abrasion asphalt, so I'm just going to select all. The asphalt grip we also don't have. Lateral is rated at a 3. And the tire stress, I am also going to go with a 3. Now, I'm going to tell you, I know this is a small data set to make considerations, but we can see that Red Bull does make a significant gain here, and Mercedes scored really badly in a track of similar conditions, which can only make me think that the only thing in 2019 that has this exact characteristic is Germany. So if I add a tire stress of 2, just for the sake of argument to try to get something that's close, we see the numbers start looking a lot more like what we're used to. And we are looking here at Mercedes, Red Bull, Ferrari, this makes a little bit of sense if we're looking at 2019. If I take 2019 out, we might actually get surprised. As you see, McLaren is the team that in 2020, under similar conditions, has been scoring more points than any other team out there. So something to consider. I did take a look into the numbers. I do believe that these reflect Austria's performance, where Lando managed to get the podium, and certainly supported by the fact that he scored the most points in average in these similar conditions. So Sergio Perez also did incredibly well. Some things to keep in mind as we're looking for this, what I think is going to be a fantastic race in Imola. I cannot wait for it. Now, I'm also including the weather because we do take that into consideration. We looked at races in the past based on changeable conditions and wet conditions, but it looks like there will be no surprises here. Very low possibility of rain. We're going to have a dry race. We're going to be at 18 degrees Celsius, which should not be a problem because track temperature should be at about 28-30 degrees, which means that we shouldn't have any issues with tires. Also important to note that wind would not be a factor here, especially because this can be a very high-speed track. So just things to keep in mind. I think that we're going to be in for an interesting race, and I believe McLaren might actually have something under their sleeve that may make a very large difference. Now, for those that haven't seen, I want to include this on our race previews. This was our team for last week as we use our AI model and we blew a wild card to be able to put it together. Very happy to announce that our prediction was actually to score 162 points and we got 164. Full disclaimer, we did get drivers score different points. Stroll wasn't predicted to not finish and get a -13, nor was Hamilton predicted to get a 49. So there was a couple of drivers that scored different amounts of points, and we got very, very close. But something that I want to look at closely. And the next thing that I want to mention is the fact that we are using a AI model, and the R squared racing tells us that we're about halfway between being able to use the data that we've gathered to justify the predictions. So the prediction confidence level is about halfway there. So something to keep in mind as we're making these predictions, and especially because Imola, there's so little data, so I would even venture to say that this would be even lower in this case. But important to note, as an exercise in this 2020 season or for the remainder, we started at the Portuguese Grand Prix. We did a single entry competition that runs from the Portuguese Grand Prix all the way to the end of the season. And I'm going to be monitoring where we stand. We started off, we are in position 343 out of 1,000 people that have entered, and I am going to check in, and my goal is to keep improving on this number using AI-based decisions after looking at all the data. So that said, let's jump into the meat and bones of this conversation. If we are looking at all potential constructors and we're looking at all potential turbo drivers, which I believe we have, then looking at a max budget of 105 million and the max predicted points come out to 199 out of a potential 500,000 possible outcomes. If we're looking at the numbers, we can see some of the results here, and the top two, and as you'll see a lot in this list, you're going to see Leclerc's name again and again because he is the only race driver this weekend that is actually on the path to the 10-point race streak. He's not on a qualifying streak, but he is on a race streak, so that is important to note. But he is on that path, and several of these models are actually including him because he may get those points, and excluding, if you're noticing, Hamilton, because the model is looking at it and saying the trade-off between Leclerc and Hamilton makes sense. Important to note, we're not taking substitution points into consideration here. So if we look at it, Hamilton only shows up in our predictions if Red Bull is in the as the constructor, simply because you got to make room for Hamilton by eliminating the Mercedes constructor. Now, also another side note, The Constructor is something I'm still working on this model. There is a ton of improvement on this model. If you're looking at me and thinking Eric is crazy for recommending 48 points on a Mercedes, yes, I do hear you out there, and we're continuing to work on it. But this is a fairly in progress model, and so far it's, at least in the indications of who's going to score more points, has been fairly accurate. Now, if we're looking at this model, we're looking at basically 199 points if we're using Stroll, Latifi, Leclerc, Vettel, Perez. Now, very important to note, Imola, once again, we have no data from the post-hybrid era on Imola. So if we come down and we take a look into some more statistics, and these are all past statistics, but if we select all, let's just bring everything back to normal and look at some past data. And let's look at particularly Ferrari, because Vettel's in this mix. If we're looking average race time, I still have to clean up, be very mindful of that. But if we're looking at average qualifying gap to leader, in this case Hamilton, and God knows almost every single race. But if we're looking the average gap to leader here, we can see that over the weeks, Ferrari has made a little bit of an improvement. Leclerc here has made a drastic improvement, but it has not been consistent, and we don't know if this is going to repeat itself. I will share that, yes, there is a lot of elevation change in Portugal in comparison to Imola, but both tracks, at least by Pirelli standards, are very similar in characteristics. So something to keep in mind if you want to make that bet on Leclerc. And if you're far behind on your fantasy team and you want a good opportunity to jump in, it wouldn't be a completely crazy idea to start betting on Leclerc. Maybe not Ferrari as a whole team because of Sebastian's slump, but that is a whole different conversation. An important piece to note if you're going to make that gamble, though, is that when we're looking at average points by position gained or lost, Leclerc does not commonly score points here, because if you'll remember Mugello, he will qualify really well. However, he does not have the race pace to sustain that position. So him starting further back and clawing his way back up is what's usually giving him his high point scoring positions. Another thing as well, they're both commonly DNFing. So on average, on the last 12 months, they have scored in average -3 points for DNFs, which a DNF is -15, but you can kind of make the math and see that they are DNFing quite a bit. They're both ranked in the high category for DNFs, which is over 20%. So again, this is a very Hail Mary type approach for trying to get your points. So I am not 100% sure that I would recommend this team. Now, with that said, if your constructor, let's take a look at a couple of constructors here. If your constructor is Racing Point, which seems to be a very, very selected team, you can still get close to 194, because at that point you get a chance to run Hamilton, Leclerc, Perez as your turbo driver, and then take on Racing Point as your team. You can put this together with only 102.5 and you can get in with 194 points. So really good team to consider if you want to consider it. I'm not sure it's going to pan out this way, because again, I am not sure that Vettel's going to go for 26 points, but this is what we're working with, again, in a model with very limited amount of data for the Imola GP. So if we're looking at it here, if you're a Perez fan for turbo drivers, a couple of different options you may want to consider. You can also look at, I'm not going to recommend Magnussen. I don't know where they got 16 points. Again, take it with a grain of salt that the model is not 100% confident on their recommendations. But there's a couple of different outcomes here that you could potentially want to look at within a budget of 105. Now, important question, is more money more better? And if you're coming to me and saying, Eric, I have 110 million to take a look at, then I am happy to tell you that yes, there is actually quite a few options that you may want to consider. Simply because if you're looking at this, you have Hamilton and Leclerc and Mercedes with Paris in your budget. This is actually a very, very strong team to run if you're close to it and you're not going to take too many penalty points for substitutions. This is something you may want to consider because Leclerc may very well hit his mark and you can switch him out for something else by the next race, and you keep Hamilton and you keep Mercedes. So, and Paris has been known to deliver quite a lot of points for turbo driver selection. So that is my prediction there, and I do believe that in this race, more money is more better. Important to note, depending on the drivers that you're picking, Verstappen is upcoming for a race streak, not in this race, but he is upcoming. And then Perez is also upcoming for a racing streak, and I believe that Perez is the one that's actually on a qualifying and a race streak if he continues to hold it. And then Gasly is also coming up for that. So very important pieces that you want to keep in mind. And again, if you're not picking Perez as your turbo driver, do seriously consider Gasly as your turbo driver. He's only scheduled for, or he's only predicted for 36 here. However, he is a phenomenal driver to consider. He is on a roll and he will deliver tons of points if he makes those streaks. So something to keep in mind. Keep it, take it for what it is, but that is my recommendation. Now, the final piece that I want to cover, just to put a final consideration, what we're doing here, possible penalty points. So I wanted to actually include this data set in the system, but I ended up with my very super technical, very high budget technical delegates report screenshot from the FIA website. But if you look at it, when it comes to internal combustion engines, turbochargers, MGUHs, and MGUKs, you have a limit of 3 before you get penalized. With regards to energy storing and control electronics, you have a limit of 2. I've highlighted everyone that's on the edge of getting penalized. If you're new to fantasy team playing, then you should be aware that penalty points, and we're in penalty season now, this is fantastic news for your drivers, because if they qualify at a certain level and have to change a component and get penalized, they get their grid penalties, you still keep your qualifying points, but the grid start positions get sent all the way down, five positions, maybe 5 positions, and if you make those positions up, you still get your average finishing position for the driver, and you get the position gain points. So penalties are a very good thing in fantasy teams, and I wanted to highlight that if you are looking to bet on someone for the very high cost, Verstappen might be a great bet. And we've seen that Lewis's form drops once he clinches a title, so switching Hamilton to Verstappen might actually be a really good strategy to consider. The same way that we're talking about this kid the entire week, we've been talking about him for the past couple of weeks. He's the only one that's managed out of the big 2 now to win a race, Pierre Gasly. He is also at the edge of it. If he switches a component by the race that he is eligible for his race streak, and he delivers on all of that, we could see something similar to how we saw with Ricardo, where he scored 100 points as a turbo driver. So again, something to keep in mind. Now, that's it for this race predictions for Imola. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Do send me some comments. Do share your thoughts. Share your teams. If you have any questions, please feel free to send them in below, and I'm happy to take a look at them. Until then, we'll see you on the next race, which I believe will be the Turkish Grand Prix. Goodbye.